When we bought the house, it felt like the beginning of a dream. Nestled in a clean, quiet suburban neighborhood just outside the city, it seemed to promise everything we had worked so hard for: peace, safety, and a tight-knit community where our 10-year-old son Timmy could ride his scooter up and down the sidewalks without worry. My wife and I had poured our savings into this place, sold our smaller home, and made sacrifices to be here. The realtor called it a family's paradise. At first, we believed it. The first warning sign didn't feel like a warning at all. On the second afternoon after we moved in, Timmy, being the hyper little explorer he was, zipped around the cul-de-sac on his blue scooter. He had this grin that stretched from ear to ear. It was the kind of thing that made all the stress of moving worthwhile. But as he made another loop near the corner, a woman emerged from a manicured yard and stepped right into his path. She had short, tightly curled hair and a scowl that could edge glass. Timmy screeched to a halt, confused. "Young man," she barked. "Scooters are not permitted in this neighborhood. Didn't your parents read the rules?" He blinked, unsure what to say. She didn't wait for a response and walked briskly away, muttering something about standards and no respect these days. That was our introduction to Karen Simmons. Later that evening, we found a note taped to our front door. It was neatly typed, addressed to the new residents of lot number 48, and signed President, Homeowners Association. The tone was scolding but drenched in fake pleasantries. It informed us that our son had already violated community regulations, and we would be fined if the behavior continued. I reread it twice, stunned that a child riding a scooter on a sidewalk could warrant a formal complaint. I asked my wife if we'd missed anything in the community welcome packet. Maybe there was a rule about that. We dug through the documents. Nothing. I decided to let it go. After all, some people are just overly strict. Maybe Karen just took the HOA stuff too seriously. I figured if we stayed out of her way, she'd leave us alone. I couldn't have been more wrong. Over the next few weeks, we received 3 more notices from the HOA. One accused us of letting our lawn grow a half-inch above regulation height. Another claimed we'd used an unapproved paint color on our mailbox post, though it was the exact same off-white every other mailbox in the neighborhood used. A third said our trash cans were left out in full view of the street for over 3 hours after pickup, which wasn't even true. I had brought them in within the hour. It was clear now. This wasn't enforcement, it was harassment. Timmy started getting nervous about going outside. Every time he so much as stepped onto the sidewalk, Karen would appear, arms crossed, watching from behind her tinted sunglasses. One afternoon, I caught her taking photos of him as he played. When I confronted her, she smiled coldly and said, "Just documenting evidence for the HOA files." That night, I installed my own camera, pointed toward our front yard. Within days, it caught Karen trespassing. She walked up to our flower bed, measured the distance between the edging and the curb, and jotted it in her notepad. Another time, she placed a plastic tag on one of our bushes and took a photo. The footage was unbelievable. I brought the recordings to an HOA meeting. It was my first one. The community center was packed, mostly older residents, many of whom seemed to know each other well. Karen presided at the head table like a queen holding court. When I raised my concerns and played the footage of her on my property, she laughed it off, claiming she was inspecting for community beautification compliance. A few board members chuckled. One older man leaned over and whispered, "She runs everything around here. Good luck." What started as petty rule enforcement quickly turned into something darker. The violation notices escalated. We received warnings about excessive noise when we had a birthday party for Timmy, even though it ended by 8 p.m. One morning, I came out to find our mailbox smashed. Another time, our garbage wasn't collected, though everyone else's on the block had been. Karen claimed we had failed to use approved bags. Then came the accident. It was a Saturday. My wife and I were inside preparing lunch when we heard a horrible thud, followed by a scream. We bolted out the front door and found Timmy lying in the street, his scooter mangled. Karen's SUV sat idling nearby. She had hit him. His leg was twisted at a terrible angle, and there was blood on his forehead. I ran to him, yelling for my wife to call 911. Karen stepped out, looked down at him, and said flatly, "He darted in front of me. That's what happens when children don't obey rules." No apology. No concern. Just blame. The hospital confirmed a broken femur and a concussion. Timmy was in pain, physically and emotionally. He barely spoke for days. Karen, meanwhile, doubled down. She called the police to file a report against us. She claimed Timmy had been a menace in the neighborhood, that we encouraged him to ignore rules, and even accused us of hostile behavior toward HOA officials. When I tried to show the footage from our camera, which captured the moments before the accident, she dismissed it as doctored. It became obvious she wasn't just a bitter neighbor. This was calculated. That's when I began digging. I requested HOA financial records. I had the right as a homeowner, but my request was denied. The response claimed the documents were confidential. That raised a red flag. I reached out to a few neighbors to see if anyone else had noticed irregularities. Most were reluctant to talk. One even said, "Karen keeps files on everyone. You don't want to make her mad." Then I met Mark. Mark was a retired accountant who had once served as the HOA's treasurer. We met at a local coffee shop. He was cautious at first, looking around before he spoke. Then he told me everything. Karen had rewritten the HOA bylaws years ago, using a forged vote to give herself indefinite control as president. She created shell committees filled with friends or fake names. Most of the board meetings were staged or only included people she knew would agree with her. She controlled the budget, the records, and even the property management company, which, I learned, she secretly owned under a different LLC. Mark had tried to speak out years earlier but was ousted. "She knows how to silence people," he said. "She threatens lawsuits, fines, whatever it takes. Most folks just give up." But I couldn't give up. My son had been hurt. My family was suffering. I started documenting everything. I took photos of every violation notice. I kept detailed logs of every interaction. I installed more cameras. I cross-referenced HOA vendor payments with state business registrations and found Karen's name linked to multiple LLCs. The HOA had paid one of them over $43,000 in landscaping consulting for a neighborhood with no common landscaping needs. I gathered everything into a dossier and contacted an attorney. He was skeptical at first, but changed his tune when he saw the documents. He helped me file a formal complaint with the state HOA regulatory board and the local district attorney. I also went to the media, anonymously at first, feeding tips to a local investigative journalist. Karen caught wind of it and retaliated hard. We were sued for defamation. A thick envelope showed up one morning, listing an absurd list of grievances: reputational damage, harassment, trespassing, for walking on HOA managed grass, and emotional distress. It was laughable on its face, but it scared us. Legal fees mounted. Timmy's therapy bills were piling up too. We were being financially suffocated. And yet, I didn't stop. The journalist I had contacted began publishing a series of articles. Public interest exploded. Suddenly neighbors were speaking out. Anonymous tips came in. One woman admitted Karen had fined her for planting the wrong kind of tulips. Another man shared how Karen threatened to revoke pool access if he didn't vote for her re-election. Piece by piece, the illusion cracked. Then came the break I needed. A former employee of Karen's fake property management company reached out. He provided invoices and emails proving Karen had billed the HOA for services never rendered. These were sent directly from her to herself. My lawyer compiled the evidence and looped in federal authorities. The IRS got involved. A month later, on a gray Thursday morning, our quiet street lit up with flashing lights. The days following the incident with Timmy were some of the darkest we had ever known. It was as if a black cloud had descended over our home, not just of grief, but of confusion, disbelief, and an overwhelming sense of helplessness. Seeing my son, once so full of energy and laughter, now confined to a hospital bed, with bandages wrapped around his leg and bruises marking his small frame, was a pain I can't quite describe. It was rage and sorrow twisted into one unbearable knot in my chest. And yet, what cut deepest was that the person responsible for this wasn't a stranger. It was our neighbor, our HOA president, Karen Simmons. After the accident, she never even came to the hospital. No apology. No phone call. No show of concern. Instead, within 24 hours, a new narrative had already begun to spread through the neighborhood, one clearly crafted by Karen herself. Whispers in the grocery store, glances on the sidewalk, and an anonymous post on the community forum that read, "Children should be supervised at all times. Accidents happen when parents are negligent." My blood boiled. She was painting us as the irresponsible ones. Even after she struck a child with her car. But Karen didn't stop there. She weaponized the HOA in a way I hadn't even imagined possible. Just days after the accident, while Timmy was still in the hospital, I received a violation notice taped to our front door. It claimed our Halloween decorations had been up past the allowable time limit and were in visual disrepair. The pumpkins were still fresh. The paper ghosts were still intact. It was the middle of October. That was just the beginning. Every other day brought a new violation notice. Grass height, trash bins placed out too early, minor cracks in the driveway, even a warning about a basketball hoop Timmy hadn't touched in weeks. She wasn't just harassing us. She was trying to break us. To drown us in fines, stress, and paranoia. It became clear this was no longer about rules or order. It was personal. And I decided I would no longer let her terrorize my family. I started documenting everything. I took photos of every violation notice, timestamped our security camera footage, recorded conversations when possible. I dug through HOA bylaws, scanned the meeting minutes, and started noticing inconsistencies. Dates didn't match. Names appeared and disappeared. Financial entries were vague. That's when I realized this wasn't just personal harassment. There was something far more sinister at play. I reached out to the only person I thought might have insight into the inner workings of the HOA, Dale, the former treasurer. He had quietly resigned a year prior, citing family reasons. But I remembered his face from the annual meetings, calm, observant, perhaps disillusioned. When I contacted him and explained what I had uncovered, there was a long pause on the phone before he said, "I've been waiting for someone to call me." We met at a coffee shop across town, away from the HOA's prying eyes and Karen's informants. Dale was tired. His eyes carried the weight of someone who had been living with knowledge he didn't want to have. Over 2 hours and 3 cups of coffee, he confirmed my suspicions. Karen had been forging meeting minutes. She was appointing fake committee members, who never showed up at actual meetings. She had dissolved the budget oversight committee under the guise of streamlining operations, and approved contracts with companies that, upon closer inspection, didn't exist outside of P.O. boxes and fake email addresses. One of those companies, it turned out, was a landscaping firm, Edenworks Maintenance, that had been paid thousands for services that were either never performed or done poorly. Dale had always suspected it was a shell company. With a little digging, we confirmed it. Edenworks was registered under an alias that traced back to Karen's maiden name. She had created a fake business, awarded it HOA contracts, and paid herself with community dues. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. We weren't just dealing with a cruel neighbor. Karen Simmons was a fraud, a liar, and a thief. And she had been running her scheme for years, hiding behind fake smiles, holiday parties, and self-righteous speeches about neighborhood values. Armed with this information, I went to a lawyer. Not just to defend us against her mounting fines and threats, but to begin building a case. We filed a formal complaint with the county. I also contacted local media, carefully and anonymously, to test the waters. One investigative reporter replied, intrigued but cautious. HOA stories were notoriously difficult to nail down. He asked for hard evidence, documents, timelines, receipts, and I gave him everything I had. I also gave him Dale's number. Within a week, he was in our kitchen with a notepad and a recorder, asking me to start from the beginning. Karen, meanwhile, began to panic. She sensed a shift. Somehow, she knew I wasn't afraid anymore. That's when she tried to hit back hard. I received a cease and desist letter from her attorney, claiming that I was defaming her, harassing her, and spreading lies. It was a thinly veiled attempt at intimidation. My lawyer filed a countersuit for harassment, emotional distress, and defamation. And we weren't alone anymore. Other neighbors, emboldened by our courage, began coming forward. Mrs. Herrera from down the street, who'd been fined $500 for painting her door the wrong shade of blue. The Johnsons, who received daily citations for their front garden, despite having lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years. Even a local contractor confessed to being paid in cash by Karen, under the table, for phantom repairs to the HOA clubhouse that never happened. The story exploded. Local news picked it up first, then regional outlets. Suburban HOA scandal rocks quiet neighborhood, was one headline. Others followed. President accused of embezzlement, targeting families. Karen's picture appeared on screen, no longer as the picture-perfect president of our HOA, but as the face of suburban tyranny. But she wasn't done fighting. Karen launched her own PR campaign. She distributed flyers throughout the neighborhood, claiming we were anti-HOA extremists, trying to sow division and undermine community values. She filed another lawsuit, this time alleging that I had hacked into HOA records and stolen private documents. It was pure fiction, but it showed how far she was willing to go to maintain her grip on power. The court battles were brutal. Every motion she filed was designed to exhaust us, financially, emotionally, mentally. But with the help of my lawyer, Dale's testimony, and the growing mountain of evidence, we held our ground. And then came the breakthrough. A subpoena revealed that over $42,000 in HOA funds had been funneled directly into a bank account owned by Edenworks Maintenance, Karen's fake company. That's when federal investigators got involved. They didn't move quickly, but they were methodical. Over several weeks, they gathered records, interviewed neighbors, traced IP addresses, and reviewed years of financial statements. What they found went beyond our neighborhood. Karen had pulled similar stunts in 2 other HOA communities in different states, using different aliases and companies. This wasn't just corruption. It was organized fraud. When the federal raid came, it was early morning. Black SUVs pulled into the cul-de-sac like shadows at dawn. Agents and windbreakers walked calmly to Karen's door and knocked. She answered, still in her robe, clutching a coffee mug. I watched from our window as she was handcuffed and placed in the back of a vehicle. The neighborhood didn't cheer, but there was a collective exhale, as if everyone had been holding their breath for years. Karen was indicted on multiple counts of fraud, wire fraud, forgery, and embezzlement. Her bail was denied. She spent the next several months awaiting trial, and for the first time, the neighborhood began to feel whole again. Timmy came home from physical therapy one day and asked, "Is she gone for good?" I knelt beside him and said, "Yes, buddy. She's gone. And she's not coming back." We had survived. But more than that, we had fought back, and we had won. The stillness that followed Karen's arrest wasn't immediate. At first, the neighborhood held its breath, as if afraid she might return, unrepentant and emboldened. For years, she had ruled over our lives like a self-appointed monarch, and even after her public downfall, people continued to walk carefully, like the phantom of her presence still lingered in the HOA bylaws or behind old security cameras she'd installed in secret. Some neighbors even avoided us, not out of animosity, but as if being too close to the family who took down the tyrant would somehow draw the next storm their way. We, too, didn't celebrate right away. Justice, though delivered, came with a weight. Timmy was still healing, physically from the injuries that had left scars on his leg and emotionally from the trauma of being hit by a neighbor's car. Nightmares still visited him sometimes. He'd wake up screaming, shaking, asking if she was outside again. No child deserves that burden. No parent deserves to see their child's innocence crushed under the heel of a neighborhood vendetta. But slowly, life began to move again. We had been living in fight or flight mode for so long that we'd forgotten what peace even sounded like. For the first time in months, I heard my wife hum while cooking. She went back to her gardening, planting tomatoes and marigolds like old times, her hands finding rhythm again in the soil. Timmy started venturing out into the front yard more often, first just to sit on the porch, then to roll a ball around, and eventually to ride his scooter again. I still remember the first time he rode past the mailbox, the same one Karen had once claimed was too decorative, and turned to flash a smile that screamed freedom. The HOA board underwent a complete transformation. The remaining members either resigned voluntarily or were legally removed when the state attorney general's office issued sanctions. What was left of the old HOA leadership crumbled in a matter of weeks, and a provisional committee, made up of volunteers from the neighborhood, stepped in to hold emergency meetings, establish financial transparency, and re-elect board members. For the first time, the HOA wasn't a shadowy council making decisions behind closed doors. It became a group of ordinary residents trying to rebuild something that had been rotting from the inside. The depth of Karen's corruption shocked even the most skeptical among us. When the federal agents raided her home and storage unit, they uncovered forged tax records, multiple sets of fake meeting minutes, and evidence that she had not only embezzled nearly $43,000 from our HOA, but also had duplicated similar scams in 2 other states, under different names. She had created shell maintenance companies, approved her own contracts as HOA president, and funneled money to herself for emergency tree trimming, electrical inspections, and even neighborhood morale events. That never happened. It was financial fraud at a level we had never imagined possible in a quiet suburb. The trial dragged on for months. I attended as often as I could. Some days, I sat silently in the back, watching her in the courtroom, finally in a position she couldn't manipulate. She no longer wore her pastel sweater sets and HOA badge with pride. Now, she was just another defendant in a navy suit with a public defender and a mountain of evidence against her. Her face was blank, but her eyes betrayed a wounded pride, like she still couldn't believe her empire had been undone by a family she'd once threatened over sidewalk chalk. When she took the stand, her tone was carefully composed, but her words were familiar. She painted herself as the victim, blamed stress, overwork, betrayal by disloyal board members, and misunderstood intentions. She said she only wanted to protect property values. That she was targeted because she cared too much. It was textbook narcissism, and it enraged everyone in the courtroom, especially the parents who had watched their children live in fear of bike rides or playing tag. The prosecutor tore through her narrative like tissue paper. By the time the verdict was read, guilty on multiple counts of wire fraud, forgery, embezzlement, reckless endangerment, and obstruction of justice, there was no applause. Just a silence thick with relief. She was sentenced to 7 years in prison. Not the life sentence some of us privately hoped for, but enough. Enough to ensure she wouldn't walk back into our neighborhood. Enough to send a message that HOA corruption is not untouchable. Once the legal chapter closed, we began the hard work of healing. We started community cleanups, restructured the HOA into a body that required term limits, public access to financial reports, and real checks and balances. The board meetings were moved to the park, open air, under string lights hung between trees. We voted on new rules together. We disagreed openly but respectfully. It felt like democracy, the way it should be. Timmy's story was shared at HOA reform seminars across the country. I spoke at 2 of them, nervously at first, but soon with conviction. I didn't want to be known for this story, but I knew I had a responsibility. If our suffering could prevent just one other family from going through what we did, it was worth it. Other HOA horror stories began emerging. One man told me his HOA president fined him $100 a week because his wheelchair ramp wasn't aesthetic. Another woman had been sued for $2,000 over flower pots on her balcony. The problem wasn't just Karen. It was a system that allowed Karen to thrive, quietly, in plain sight. As a result of our case, our state passed a bill mandating annual third-party financial audits for HOAs over a certain size. It also required election oversight for board positions, and gave residents the right to access all community records within 10 business days upon request. Small victories, but victories nonetheless. Despite all the battles and victories, I'll never forget the emotional toll it took on us. There were nights I sat in the dark living room, afraid that the next sunrise would bring another lawsuit, another notice, another humiliation. I had spent so long bracing for impact that peace felt unfamiliar, like the calm after a hurricane when you're still unsure if the roof will hold. But then one night, as I tucked Timmy into bed, he whispered, "I'm not scared anymore." I froze for a moment. Those 4 words carried more weight than any court ruling. That's when I knew we had truly won, not in the legal system, not in the HOA, but in the soul of our family. There were scars left behind. Friendships broken. Trust in neighbors that needed rebuilding. Even Dale, the former treasurer who had at first helped me, then turned on us by leaking edited footage, eventually wrote us a letter. It was handwritten, apologetic, and remorseful. He said he'd been manipulated, threatened, and eventually just too tired to keep resisting. He asked for forgiveness. I didn't answer right away. I didn't know if I could. But weeks later, we saw him at a community event, quietly helping set up tables. We nodded to each other. That was enough. By the end of that year, our neighborhood looked the same on the outside, trimmed hedges, American flags fluttering, kids walking to school, but on the inside, it was different. People waved more, talked more. We weren't just residents now. We were survivors of something that could have broken us but didn't, and I was different too. I wasn't just a father, or a homeowner, or a man with a good job and a well-kept lawn. I was someone who had faced corruption, stared it down, and refused to blink. I had seen what one determined person can uncover, and what an entire community can rebuild once the fear is gone. People sometimes ask me, "If you knew what would happen, would you still have moved into that house?" And the honest answer is, yes, not because I enjoyed what we went through. I wouldn't wish that on anyone. But because we exposed something that needed to be seen. We showed that power without scrutiny is dangerous, even in the most mundane, suburban settings. We taught our son that you don't run from injustice, you stand your ground. And we learned, as a family, that no matter how dark things get, the truth will always find a crack to shine through, even in the most manicured cul-de-sac, even behind the prettiest picket fences, even in a place ruled by someone like Karen Simmons.